The sickness came before the knowing did. I remember standing at the bathroom sink at 5 in the morning, gripping the cold porcelain with both hands, watching my own reflection like it belonged to someone else. My face was pale. My dark hair clung to my temples in damp strands. My stomach had been doing this for 3 weeks, this rolling, lurching rebellion every time I tried to eat, every time I caught a certain smell, every time the morning light pushed through the curtains at too sharp an angle. I had told myself it was stress. I had told myself it was the change in seasons, the new apartment, the new job, the 1,000 small upheavals that had rearranged my life in the past 2 months. I had told myself a lot of things that were not true. The test sat on the back of the toilet tank. I had bought it the night before, slipped it into my coat pocket at the pharmacy like it was something I should be ashamed of, paid for it without meeting the cashier's eyes. I had not opened it when I got home. I had set it down and made tea and sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, watching the steam curl off the surface of the cup, until the tea went cold and the night went deep and still. Now it was morning, and the sickness had woken me again, and the test was still sitting there in its little cardboard box, and I was out of excuses. I opened it. I followed the directions even though my hands were shaking. I set it on the counter and stood back and stared at the pale peach tiles above the tub while I waited. I counted the grout lines. I had gotten to 37 when I looked down. 2 lines. I sat down on the edge of the tub, slowly, like a person lowering themselves into cold water. I held the test in both hands and looked at it for a long time. My chest was doing something complicated. There was fear in there, undeniably, sharp and bright as a splinter. But underneath the fear, there was something else, something warmer and quieter and more frightening than the fear, because I did not have a name for it yet. Something that felt, in some dim and confused way, like recognition, like my body had known before my mind did, like some part of me had been waiting. I am an omega. I have known this since I was 16, when my first presentation hit me like a fever, and my mother sat me down at the kitchen table and explained in careful, practical terms what it would mean for my life. She was an omega too, she told me, and her mother before her, and it was nothing to be ashamed of, and everything to be wise about. She gave me a pamphlet from the clinic, a small blue booklet with simple illustrations and plain language, and she sat with me while I read it and answered my questions without flinching. My mother was good at that, not flinching. I grew up understanding my biology with a kind of clear-eyed practicality. I took my suppressants on schedule. I managed my heats carefully, privately, without drama. I did not let my designation define me, did not let it be the most interesting thing about me. I had a degree in landscape architecture. I had a good eye for spatial design and an obsessive love of old Macs and an embarrassing weakness for honey in my coffee. I had a small collection of succulents on my windowsill that I talked to when no one was watching. I was more than my designation. I knew that. But here in this bathroom, in this early morning hour, holding this test with 2 lines on it, I was also undeniably, inescapably, an omega who was carrying a child. Joey Quinn's child. I closed my eyes. Joey Quinn. Even thinking his name did something to my breathing. Even now, after everything, after the silence and the distance and the weeks that had stretched between us like a cold ocean. Even now, his name in my mind was like pressing on a bruise, that particular combination of ache and aliveness that told you something still mattered, something was still very much not resolved. I set the test down on the counter. I washed my face with cold water. I looked at my reflection again, and this time the person looking back at me seemed a little more present, a little more solid, a little more like they had somewhere to be and something to do. I needed to call him. I needed to tell him. I just had no idea yet what telling him would set in motion. Let me tell you about Joey Quinn. I met him 8 months ago at a project site where I had been contracted to design a rooftop garden for a private building in the north of the city. The building was old, one of those heavy stone structures from another century that somehow survived everything the city had thrown at it, and the owner wanted something on the roof that would justify the rent she charged her tenants. Something beautiful. Something that would make people want to stay. I was on the roof measuring when he appeared at the stairwell door. He was tall. That was the first thing. Tall in a way that the doorframe almost disagreed with. had to negotiate around. He had dark hair that was just slightly too long, the kind of length that suggested not carelessness, but rather a man who had more pressing things to think about than haircuts. He wore a charcoal jacket over a plain dark shirt, and he had the look of someone perpetually slightly distracted, someone whose mind was always running a secondary program in the background. He stopped when he saw me. Something crossed his face quickly, something I did not have time to read, and then his expression settled into a careful neutrality that I would come to recognize as his default public face, the one he wore when he was working very hard at something. He introduced himself. He told me he was an architect, that he consulted on restoration projects for old buildings, that the owner had hired him to assess the structural integrity of the roof before any garden installation could begin. He said all of this in a measured, even voice, the kind of voice that had learned to contain itself. I told him my name and what I was there to do. I shook his hand. The moment his palm met mine, I felt something I had no clinical term for. Not chemistry, exactly, though it was that. Not recognition, though it was that too. Something older, something that went below the level of language and thought, and dropped directly into the body, into the nervous system, into whatever part of a person knows things before they can be articulated. The air between us shifted in a way I could not explain and did not try to, because we were professionals on a job site, and I was not going to make a fool of myself over a handshake. I let go of his hand. I went back to my measurements. He went to his assessment. We worked in silence for 2 hours with the city spread out around us and the late autumn wind cutting across the rooftop. And twice I caught him looking at me, and twice he glanced away with that same studied neutrality. And by the time I was packing up my equipment, I had made a decision that I was absolutely not going to act on any of this. He was an alpha. I could tell by his scent even at distance, even over the cold wind, that particular warmth and depth that an alpha carries like a second signature. And alphas and omegas are a complicated equation, one I had learned to be careful with. I did not want uncomplicated biology making decisions my brain should be making. I had a rule about that, a sensible, well-considered rule that had served me very well for 28 years. Joey Quinn ruined that rule within 3 weeks. It was not dramatic. It was not a single moment of surrender. It was a slow accumulation of small things. The way he remembered exactly how I took my coffee when we started meeting to discuss the project. The way he listened when I talked about the garden design with a focused attention that felt almost rare in the world. The way he laughed when something genuinely struck him as funny, fully and without self-consciousness, as if laughter was something his body did without asking his permission. He was serious but not cold, careful but not distant. He had opinions and he shared them, and he also changed his mind when presented with a better idea, which I found disarming in a man who was so clearly confident. He had depth, actual depth, the kind that takes years to build and cannot be performed. And he looked at me sometimes with something in his eyes that he immediately, deliberately tucked away, and I found myself wondering about that tucked away thing more than I should have. The first time he touched me beyond the handshake was 5 weeks in, when I lost my footing on the partially completed rooftop garden after a rain had made the surface slick. His hand caught my arm before I went down, and he held on for a moment longer than strictly necessary. And we were very close, and the wind had gone very still, and I looked up at him, and he looked down at me, and that tucked-away thing was right there on the surface of his face, undeniable. He stepped back. He let go of my arm. He asked if I was all right, with that careful, neutral voice. I told him I was fine. Neither of us was fine. We had dinner for the first time 2 days later. We said it was to discuss the project timeline. We both knew it was not. We sat across from each other at a small table near the window of a restaurant neither of us had chosen, for any reason other than that it was equidistant from where we both lived. And we talked about everything except the project. We talked about the buildings he had worked on, the strange and beautiful damage that old structures sustained, and the even stranger beauty of their repair. We talked about my training, the professors who had shaped how I saw space and nature, the first garden I had ever designed and how badly it had gone, and what I had learned from the failure. We talked about our families and the way people do when they are being honest but careful, offering small windows instead of full doors. He did not touch my hand across the table. He did not make any move that could be read as more than professional friendliness. But when we stepped out onto the pavement after, and the night was cold, and I turned up the collar of my coat, He paused and looked at me with that open, unguarded look again, and said something that I have turned over in my mind many times since. "I want you to know," he said, "that I am not someone who does things carelessly." I asked him what he meant. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I mean that if I do something, I mean it. I don't do things halfway, and I don't say things I don't mean. I need you to know that about me before anything else." It was an odd thing to say, an almost formal declaration. I did not fully understand it at the time. I filed it away carefully and told him I appreciated honesty, and we said goodnight, and I walked home in the cold, with my heart doing something it had not done in a very long time. 2 weeks later, after a long evening that began as a project review and became something else entirely as the hours dissolved around us, he kissed me on the pavement, outside my building in the fine cold rain, very deliberately, both hands framing my face. And it was nothing like a half measure. I had the thought, standing there in the rain being kissed by Joey Quinn, that this was the beginning of something that would change me, not damage me, not diminish me, change me, the way a landscape changes when something new takes root in it, shifts the balance of light and shadow, becomes something the land could not imagine being without. I was right about that. I had no idea how completely right I was. The 3 months before I found out I was pregnant were the 3 best months of my adult life, and I do not say that as a person given to exaggeration. They were quiet months, in many ways. We did not go on extravagant trips or make dramatic declarations. We cooked in his apartment and in mine. We walked the city on weekend mornings when neither of us had anywhere to be. We disagreed about films and agreed about almost everything else, and learned the geography of each other slowly and without rushing, the way you explore somewhere you think you might want to live for a long time. He was tender with me in private in a way that still surprised me, even after months, a deliberate, attentive tenderness that I had not expected from a man who moved through the world with such self-contained restraint. He noticed things. He remembered things. When I was tired, he did not ask me questions, just made space and warmth around me, and let me rest. When I was anxious about a project, he would pull the problem apart with me at the kitchen table, methodical and patient, until it was manageable again. I fell in love with him. I am not certain of the exact moment, because it was one of those loves that does not arrive in a single wave, but builds the way water does, quietly and then all at once. I knew it was complete when I realized one morning that I had stopped imagining my future without him in it. He was simply there, in the picture, a fixed point. I did not tell him. I was building up to it. I was choosing my moment. And then something changed. It was gradual at first, subtle enough that I second-guessed my own perception. He was still present, still warm, still himself, but there was a new quality to his silences, a different weight. He would go somewhere behind his eyes sometimes, somewhere I could not follow, and come back looking like a person who had been told difficult news and was deciding how to carry it. I asked him once carefully if something was wrong. He told me no, told me he was just tired, told me a project had been more complicated than expected. I accepted it because I wanted to accept it, because the alternative, that something was wrong with us, was something I was not ready to hold. Then came the weekend he canceled our plans. Then the week he was unreachable for 2 days. Then the night I showed up at his apartment because I had been worried, and he answered the door looking like a man who had not slept in days, disheveled and dim-eyed and somehow smaller than himself. And when I touched his face, he turned into it for just a moment, like he was starving for it, and then stepped back and put distance between us, and said in that careful, contained voice, "I need some time, Julio. I need to think." I asked him what he needed to think about. He said he was not sure how to explain it yet. I asked if it was us. He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I don't want it to be. But there's something I haven't told you, something I should have told you before we started this, and I need to figure out how." I wanted to push. I am not by nature a patient person when it comes to things that matter. But there was something in his face that night that stopped me, something that looked very much like genuine pain, not the pain of someone falling out of love, but the pain of someone fighting very hard not to let something take something from them. So I told him I was there, when he was ready, and I spent the next 2 weeks in the particular misery of not knowing. He texted, he called. The connection was thinner than it had been, but it was there. I held on to it. And then the morning sickness started. And then came the morning with the test, and the 2 lines, and the cold porcelain sink. And now I was sitting in my kitchen at 6 in the morning, with a cup of tea I was not drinking, my phone in my hand. A conversation I did not know how to begin, waiting on the other side of a contact saved as Joey Quinn, with a small blue bookmark emoji that he had put there himself one night when he was being playful, and I had laughed and never changed it. I pressed call. It rang 4 times. He picked up, and his voice had the particular roughness of early morning, and despite everything, despite the fear and the confusion and the knot in my chest, the sound of his voice made something in me unclench with relief. "Julio, I need to see you," I said. "Today. I need to see you today." A pause, not a hesitation, something more deliberate than that, like a man steeling himself. "Okay," he said. "Come here. I'll be here." He opened the door before I could knock, which meant he had been listening for me, which meant he was as undone by the waiting as I was. He looked better than he had 2 weeks ago, and worse than the Joey I had known for months before that. There were shadows under his eyes that spoke of chronically interrupted sleep. He was wearing the dark gray sweater I liked, the soft, thick one, and I had the irrational thought that he had put it on deliberately, that he was trying to be familiar, approachable, like a person arranging furniture to make a difficult conversation easier. I came inside, I sat on his couch. He sat in the chair across from me, not beside me, and the deliberate nature of that distance told me he was holding himself carefully, that he did not trust himself to be too close, and that both frightened me and moved me in a way I could not quite reconcile. I put the test on the coffee table between us. He looked at it. He was very still for a long moment, the kind of stillness that is not calm, but is instead the complete suspension of motion while something enormous is processed. Then he looked at me. His eyes were the color of deep water, gray-green and shifting, and what was in them right then was the most complicated thing I had ever seen on a human face. There was shock, yes, and beneath the shock, something that arrived so quickly and so involuntarily that I do not think he could have stopped it if he tried. Something that looked unmistakably like joy, raw and blinding, and completely at war with every other thing on his face. And then, watching him, I saw the moment something else moved through him, something that extinguished the joy the way a hand closes over a candle. His face went very still, and his jaw tightened, and he looked away from me, and when he looked back, he was somewhere else, somewhere distant and enclosed and carefully armored. "How long have you known?" His voice was steady. "Since this morning. I just found out this morning." He nodded, a small controlled movement. "Joey." I leaned forward. "Talk to me. Whatever it is, just talk to me. I have been waiting for weeks for you to talk to me, and I think that right now I have earned the right to actually understand what is going on with you." He stood up, walked to the window, stood there with his back to me and his hands at his sides, staring out at the gray morning, and for a moment I thought he was not going to speak at all. Then he turned around. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to let me tell all of it before you react. Can you do that?" I told him I could. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs, and I waited. He sat back down, this time on the other end of the couch. Closer, but still careful with the distance between us. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew meant he was gathering himself. "There is a prophecy," he said. I heard the words, I turned them over, I said very carefully, "A prophecy." "I know how it sounds." "How does it sound, Joey?" "It sounds like I've lost my mind." The ghost of something almost wry crossed his face and disappeared. "I have been told it since I was a child, by my father, by his father before him. It goes back generations in my family, in my bloodline, and I have spent my entire adult life trying to outrun it." I was quiet. He took that as permission to continue. "My family has a history," he said, "not the kind of history that gets written down in books you'd find anywhere. The kind that gets passed down around tables, late at night, the kind the older generations speak about in a specific tone that tells you, this is not metaphor, this is not family mythology, this is something they believe with their whole bodies." He paused, looked at his hands. "My grandfather told me about it when I was 7. I thought it was a story, the way children think most things adults say in serious voices are simply dramatic. He told me that in our bloodline, going back further than he could trace, there was a bond, a destined bond, alpha to omega, that when it was completed, when it was sealed in the deepest way possible, would wake something in the world, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. He said it would not simply be a child born. He said it would be the fulfillment of something ancient, something with consequences none of us could fully predict." I felt something move through the room, Not physically, not a draft, not a sound, something subtler and more primal. The way the air changes before a storm, a pressure shift in the atmosphere of things. He said the bond would produce an heir, Joey continued. Not just a child, an heir to something older than our names. That this child would carry a gift and a burden that would alter the course of things, for our kind and beyond. That the world had been waiting for this child the way it waits for rain at the end of a long drought. He looked up at me. He said the alpha in this bond would know their omega the moment they met them, would know in the body, in the blood, before a single word was spoken. I thought about the rooftop, the handshake, the way the air had changed. He said the alpha would have a choice, Joey went on, and now his voice had a roughness in it that he was working against. To accept the bond or to run from it. Many had run. He told me they always ran eventually, because the weight of what the prophecy demanded was too much. The responsibility of it, the not knowing exactly what it meant, what waking this ancient thing would cost. He said every alpha in our line eventually ended up at the same crossroads, and every one of them had to choose. He stood up again. He could not seem to hold still for this. I was 18 when I first understood he meant me, not the generations before me, me. My grandfather lived until I was 22, and in those last years he was very specific, very clear. He said the bond would find me. He said the omega would be unlike any person I had ever encountered. He said when it happened I would know, and knowing I would have to decide. He turned to face me fully. I have been running since I was 25, Julio. I have not stayed anywhere for more than a year. I have not allowed myself to build anything that would root me, because I believed that if I kept moving, if I never let a bond form, I could avoid it. I told myself it was superstition, old man's stories, but I could never fully believe that, because my grandfather was the most rational man I ever knew, and he spoke about this the way he spoke about engineering. Not faith, evidence, pattern. He stopped. And then I went to that rooftop, and I met you, and I knew. The room was very quiet. That is what you have been running from, I said softly. Not from you. He said it fast and fierce, the restraint breaking for a moment. Never from you. I want you to understand that. What I felt from the first moment was not something I wanted to run from. What I was running from was the prophecy, the weight of it, the not knowing what it would demand of us, what it would do to you, to any child we might have. I have spent my entire adult life terrified of becoming someone else's burden, of pulling someone I loved into something they did not choose and could not escape. I stood up, I crossed the space between us, and I stood in front of him, and I waited until he looked at me. We are already in it, I told him. He closed his eyes. Something moved across his face, behind his eyelids, something enormous and private. When he opened them again, his eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears, but was the near neighbor of them. I know, he said. He reached out and took my hand, both of mine and both of his, the way he had done from the very beginning, deliberate and complete, meaning it all the way. I know, he said again, and I am done running. It took us several days after that to find solid ground again, not because the love had gone anywhere, but because we were both carrying something new now, something that required us to recalibrate everything we thought we understood about what we were to each other. He told me more. In pieces, over those days, he gave me everything he had been keeping to himself. He told me about his grandfather, a man named Elder Quinn, a builder and a scholar in quiet, private ways, a man who had spent 60 years collecting every fragment he could find of the old lore that surrounded their bloodline. Texts so old that the language in them had shifted beyond easy reading. Records written in margins of religious books by people whose names were lost. Transcriptions passed down through generations, copied by hand, painstaking and reverent. His grandfather had believed in the prophecy, not because he was superstitious, but because he had done the research of a careful man. He had traced the bloodline back through its cycles, found the pattern in the births and the bonds and the children who carried something different in their lives, something that rippled outward in ways that were hard to dismiss as coincidence. Not every generation, not every branch, but in a line threading through centuries, always alpha to omega, always a bond of profound recognition, always a child born of that bond, who went on to do something that changed the landscape of their community or their world in ways small and large. The particular prophecy that attached to Joey was older than the others, more specific. It spoke, in the fragments his grandfather had assembled, of a bond between an alpha who had the gift of structure, of building and restoring what had been damaged, and an omega who had the gift of growth, of creating living things in spaces where living things were not expected to survive. These two in bond would bring forth a child who would carry both gifts combined in a way never seen before. And this child would heal something in the foundation of their world that had been cracked for so long, no one living remembered the original breaking. I sat with this for a long time. A builder, a restorer of old things, a person who grew gardens in impossible places. The precision of it frightened me and amazed me in equal measure. I want to see what he found, I told Joey, all of it. I don't want to be kept outside of this. This is mine now too. He looked at me for a moment with something so open in his face that it caught in my throat. I was afraid, he said quietly, that if you saw all of it, you would want to leave. I took his face in my hands. I told him that was not going to happen. He brought out the old texts. They were in a wooden case, the kind with a simple brass clasp, that he had been carrying from apartment to apartment for years without ever fully opening. Some of the documents inside were photocopies of originals, kept in places too fragile to handle. Some were his grandfather's handwritten notes, precise and dense, building an argument with the discipline of a man who trusted evidence over emotion. We read them together, sitting on his floor with the wooden case open between us and tea going cold on the low table behind us. And as I read, something in my body responded to the words in a way my mind had not prepared for. A settling, a deep, cellular recognition, the way the body receives a truth it has always known but never had language for. The text spoke of the child as a healer of foundations, not metaphorically or not only metaphorically. The word in the oldest version, which his grandfather had had translated by a linguist he trusted, carried multiple meanings simultaneously. It meant one who repairs what is broken at the root. It meant one who reconciles what has been divided. It meant one who reminds the world of what it has forgotten about itself. It said this child would not come easily into the world. It said the bond that produced them had to be chosen freely, both by Alpha and Omega, with full knowledge of what was being chosen. That the prophecy could not be fulfilled through accident or ignorance. It required consent and awareness and the deliberate, clear-eyed decision to step into the weight of it together. I looked up from the page. Full knowledge, I said. Joey was watching me. Full knowledge, I repeated, which means us sitting here right now, reading this together, is part of it. My grandfather believed that, he said. He believed every generation that had fulfilled the prophecy had reached this exact moment, and every generation that had not had turned away before they got here. The running was always about fear, and the staying was always about choosing, even with the fear. I set the paper down carefully. I looked at this man across from me, this man who had carried this alone for so long, this man who had run from something he was terrified of losing control of, and had still, when the moment came, when I had stood in front of him with a pregnancy test between us and demanded honesty, had told me everything instead of running again. You stopped running, I said. I tried to run, he said honestly. The last few weeks, that is what the distance was. I found out I was in love with you, and I panicked because that meant the bond was real and the prophecy was real, and I could not pretend any more that any of it was just old stories. He was quiet for a moment. You called me, and I heard your voice in the early morning, and I thought about every morning of the rest of my life without your voice in it, and it was the clearest possible sign that there was nothing left to run from, there was only this. He reached out and touched my hand, gently, deliberate, the way he always was. There was only you, he said. The pregnancy was not simple. I want to be honest about this, because the story would be a lie if I told it as if every day was golden. There were hard weeks. There were mornings where the sickness was so complete I could not stand without the room tilting, and Joey would sit on the bathroom floor with me and hold my hair back and not say anything, just be present, just be solid, while everything else was fluid. There were nights I was frightened in a way that had nothing to do with the prophecy and everything to do with the plain and ordinary terror of carrying a life inside you that you are responsible for before you have even met them. And they were strange things, things I could not explain and did not try to explain in ordinary terms, because ordinary terms were no longer adequate. It began with the plants. I have always had good hands with growing things. It is what drew me to landscape architecture in the first place. But in the weeks after I found out I was pregnant, something shifted in that capacity, in a way that went beyond skill. Plants in my apartment grew with a velocity that had nothing to do with care, or watering, or season. The succulents on the windowsill put out new growth every few days, intricate and vivid, colors I had not seen in those particular species before. A cutting I had failed to root for months took hold overnight, and by the end of a week had unfurled 3 new leaves of an almost luminous green. I brought it up carefully with Joey because I was not sure if I was imagining it, not sure if pregnancy hormones were simply making me more observant, more attuned to things I would ordinarily miss. He came to my apartment and stood in front of the windowsill for a long time, without speaking. "It is not your imagination," he said finally. "How do you know?" He told me to come look at his drafting table. I had not been to his workroom in 2 weeks. When I walked in, I stopped in the doorway. His work is restoration, old buildings. He draws plans by hand as well as digitally, detailed studies of structures and their bones, and those drawings cover the walls of his workroom in organized configurations. I knew this room. I had stood in it many times, but the drawings on the wall had changed, not been replaced, not added to, but changed within themselves. Details had become more precise, lines more confident and exact, as if the drawings were resolving themselves towards some perfect final form. And on his drafting table, half-finished plans for a project he had been struggling with for months were covered in new work he did not remember doing. He had woken 2 days before to find the plans advanced significantly, in his own hand, with a clarity and confidence of line that felt like it came from somewhere beyond his ordinary ability. We stood in his workroom and looked at each other. "The prophecy said the gifts combine in the child," I said slowly, "but I wonder if they speak to each other first, if carrying this child is already beginning something." He nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. Over the following weeks, we kept a record. I wrote down everything unusual with the plants. He recorded the changes in his work. We compared notes with the precision of his grandfather's methodology, building a picture of something we could neither dismiss nor fully understand. And there was one more thing. Dreams. I had always been a vivid dreamer, but now, in pregnancy, the dreams were different. They had the quality of memory rather than invention. I would wake from them with a residue of place and detail that faded more slowly than dreams usually did. That left me sitting up in bed in the dark, feeling as if I had been somewhere very real and very old. In the most recurring dream, I stood in a landscape I could not place geographically. A wide open land, neither desert nor forest, but something between, and the ground was cracked, deeply and extensively cracked, the kind of cracking that suggested profound drought or ancient upheaval. Nothing grew in this landscape. The sky above it was a color I could not name, not gray, not blue, not any particular hour of day. And in my hands, in the dream, I held something. I could never see exactly what it was, only that it was small and warm and alive. And when I held it and stood in this cracked and barren landscape, things began to grow, up through the cracks, slow at first, tentative, then with increasing certainty. Green things, living things, not garden plants or cultivated things, but the wild foundational plants, the ones that come first after devastation, that hold soil together and make the ground ready for everything that follows. I told Joey about the dream. He went very still. He told me he had been having a dream too. In his dream, he stood in a structure so old and so damaged that it should not have been standing. Columns cracked through, archways separated from their keystones, walls leaning at angles that defied physics. He stood in this impossible structure, and he held something in his hands, small and warm and alive, and when he held it, the structure began to repair itself. Slowly, stone finding stone, crack ceiling, arch regrounding. Same landscape, we realized, seen from different perspectives. The same small, warm, living thing in both our hands. Joey's family knew before we told them. I do not mean this in a supernatural sense, though by this point I was not ruling anything out. I mean that the people in his bloodline who carried the knowledge of the prophecy had been watching for it for so long that when the signs came, they were paying attention. His aunt, a woman named Quinn, who had always been the keeper of the family's records after his grandfather passed, arrived at his apartment on a Saturday morning, 3.5 months into my pregnancy. She was a compact, sharp-eyed woman of about 60, with her nephew's same quality of contained intensity, and a manner that suggested she had long since dispensed with unnecessary social ceremony. She looked at me for a long moment when we were introduced. Then she looked at Joey. And then she did something unexpected. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands for just a moment and said, quietly, to herself, "He actually stopped running." She looked up. Her eyes were bright. "I need you to understand what this means," she told us both. "Not as mythology, not as family story. I mean what it means practically, right now, going forward." She had brought a folder with her. More documents, more fragments and records in her own research, the decades she had spent after Elder Quinn's death, continuing the work he had started. She had found something he had not. The original source, she said, or as close to it as any of us have gotten. She laid a set of high-resolution photographs on the table, images of stone carvings, very old stone, the kind of age you feel in your chest rather than calculate with your brain. The carvings were partially damaged by time, but legible in enough of their extent to read the pattern. She had had them translated by 3 separate experts, each working independently. The translations agreed on the core. It spoke of a child born a freely chosen bond. It spoke of gifts inherited from both lines, the gift of building and the gift of growing, and the third gift that emerged from their combination, the gift of mending. Not healing in a medical sense, though the word had that valence too. Mending in the sense of bringing together what had been sundered, of finding the place where something was broken and placing something living there, something that would grow into the gap and hold it shut. The text said this child would not be ordinary in the ways the world understood. They said the world would know. Not in trumpets and catastrophe, not in signs visible from miles, but in a quiet and pervasive way, the way a fundamental shift in temperature changes a whole ecosystem slowly and then all at once. Communities would feel it. The world would begin, in small and incremental ways, to repair itself in the places it had been most damaged, as if reminded of what it was capable of. The child does not do this actively, Petra said carefully. They are not a tool. They are a presence, a possibility that wakes other possibilities. The world responds to what they carry. She looked at me then, very directly, which means they need to be protected, supported, raised not under the weight of this, but sheltered from it long enough to grow into it. They need to be a child first. She looked at Joey. They need a father who is present and not running. Joey held her gaze steadily. "I'm not running," he said. She studied him for a long moment with the particular evaluative attention of a person who has been watching for this her whole life. Then she nodded, once, deeply, like a period at the end of a sentence. "Good," she said. "There is a thing that happens when you stop bracing against what is coming and simply let it arrive. A sophonym. Not of the difficulty, because the difficulty is still there. Every hard thing still has to be faced and moved through. But of the resistance to it. The exhaustion of constant vigilance eases and something else enters the space. Something that feels, unexpectedly, like presence, like being entirely where you are." This is what the following months felt like. Joey and I did not move in together immediately. We had learned enough about ourselves by then to know that rushing into structures before their foundations were properly built was not wisdom. We did things at the pace they needed. He spent 3 nights a week at my apartment, and I spent 2 at his, and we had dinner together most evenings, and we began to build the ordinary daily rhythms that are the actual substance of a life shared. He came to every appointment. He sat beside me in waiting rooms and asked the doctors careful, detailed questions, not because he did not trust them, but because he trusted being informed. He took notes. He researched. He applied to our situation the same methodical intelligence he gave to a building he loved, the determination to understand the structure from the foundation up. I found this impossibly reassuring. I had not known before Joey Quinn how much I needed a partner who paid attention, not who performed attention, not who performed care, but who was genuinely curious about the details of the thing in front of them, and treated that curiosity as a form of love. The garden on the rooftop was finished, eventually, long after the professional deadline and with far more of both our work in it than the contract had called for. He had incorporated structural elements that enhanced how the plants were able to root and grow, designing supports that allowed the garden to expand and change with time. I had designed a planting scheme that moved with the seasons, that was never finished, always becoming. The building owner was bewildered by how much we had exceeded the brief. She told us at the unveiling that she had not expected to feel moved by a rooftop garden. She told us it felt like something healing. We looked at each other briefly and then looked away, and Joey took my hand, without saying anything, his thumb moving over my knuckles in the quiet small way it did when he was feeling something he did not yet have words for. The strange things continued, manageable and extraordinary in equal measure. My capacity with plants expanded in ways that were genuinely useful, that I began to incorporate professionally with results my clients described as extraordinary. Joey's restoration work reached a level of precision and insight that drew professional attention. Projects offered to him that he had never been in a position to be considered for before. We did not speak about these things as supernatural, exactly. We spoke about them as a deepening, as gifts that had always been there, growing into their full form. And the dreams changed, both of ours, in the same week, in the same direction. The cracked landscape in my dream began, for the first time, to show color before I woke. Not everywhere, not fully, but in the places I stood, in the radius of what I held, the green coming up through the cracks was vivid and real, and there was the beginning, just the beginning, of something that might eventually become verdant. Joey's dream structure began, for the first time, to feel stable underfoot. Still massively damaged, still old and listing and dangerous in its upper reaches, but at the level where he stood, the stone was holding, the repairs were taking. We told each other about these changes the same morning, over coffee, and sat with them for a while in that particular quiet that falls when something important is being recognized together. It's responding, I said. Whatever the landscape is, whatever the structure is, it's responding to us deciding. My grandfather said it would. Joey looked at his coffee. He said the world does not wait to be certain. It begins to change the moment the choice is made. I thought about that. He knew you would be the one, I said. He hoped. A small shadow moved across his face. He was afraid I would run too long. He told me the window was not infinite, that the longer an alpha ran from the prophecy, the harder it became to stop. What made you able to stop? He looked up at me. You, he said simply. Not in a romantic story way, not in a way where you fixed me or saved me. In the way where being near you made the thing I was running from seem less terrifying than the idea of being far from you. The fear did not go away. I was still afraid, but it became smaller than the other thing. What other thing? He smiled. It was the full smile, the real one, the one that arrived without asking permission. The love, he said. It became smaller than the love. 6 months in, we had the conversation about names. We had found out at our last appointment that we were expecting a boy. Joey had been very still in the room while the doctor confirmed it, that particular stillness of his that I had learned to read as deep internal processing. And when we got outside into the air, he had taken a very long break, slow breath, and looked at the sky for a moment before looking at me. I asked what he was thinking. He said he was thinking about his grandfather. He said Elder Quinn had been a good man, the best man he had known, a man of rigor and gentleness together, who had never made Joey feel that the prophecy was a sentence, but had always framed it as an invitation, who had loved his grandson not as the carrier of something ancient, but as a person first and foremost. He said he wanted to be that for this child, the person who could hold both things, the ordinary human love and the extraordinary context, without letting one consume the other. He said to name the child wisely, Joey told me. He didn't mean a specific name. He meant name him with intention, with something that means what you want him to know about himself. I had been thinking about names for weeks. I had a list on my phone that I had been adding to and subtracting from, considering and reconsidering. I pulled it up. We sat on the bench outside the clinic in the late afternoon light and went through it together. We spent 2 hours on it, which is the right amount of time to spend on a name. We settled finally on Elias. From a root meaning, my strength is in the living. The old language version, the one that carried all its meanings at once. We liked that it was quiet and strong, and that it belonged to him already, before he arrived, as something for him and not as a monument to what had come before him. We would tell him, when he was old enough, everything. Not as a weight, but as a story, not as a destiny, but as a context, a lineage of people who had chosen and what that choosing had made possible. He would decide for himself what he did with what he carried. That was the point. That had always been the point. Joey asked me to move in with him when I was 7 months along. He did not do it impulsively. He had clearly thought it through in the way he thought through any structure from the foundation up. He had sat across from me at dinner one evening with a certain purposeful quality to his posture. The quality that meant he had come prepared to say a thing directly. and he told me that he had been thinking about space, about what kind of space he wanted Elias to grow up in, about what kind of space he wanted us to inhabit together, and he had a proposal, not the apartment. Neither of his most recent apartments, both of them chosen for the transience of a man who moved every year, functional and fine, but not built for permanence. He had found a building. Old, of course. He was not capable of choosing something new. A wide stone-faced building in a quieter part of the city, a former residential building that had been empty for several years and had fallen into the specific dignified neglect of something awaiting the right attention. It had a courtyard. It had a garden space that was currently nothing but compacted earth and old stone and the ghosts of previous planting. He had put in an offer. He wanted to restore it. He wanted me to make the garden. He wanted us to live in it. I sat with this for a moment. This enormous, specific, completely characteristic gesture, so entirely like him in its combination of the practical and the profound, the way he could express love through the language of structure and space and careful investment in something built to last. I looked at him across the table. "You looked at it already," I said. "I have been looking at it for a month. And you didn't tell me. I wanted to make sure it was right first. And is it?" "The bones are extraordinary," he said. "There are original details under a century of paint that are going to take years to uncover properly. The courtyard faces southeast. Morning light from 8 to about 2. The soil in the garden is damaged but workable. You would probably want to—" He stopped himself, the ghost of amusement on his face. "I'll stop before I make this sound like a structural report." "Don't stop," I said. "I like it when you make things sound like structural reports." He reached across the table and took my hand. "Come see it," he said. "That's all I'm asking. Come see it and tell me what you think." I saw it the following weekend. I walked into the courtyard and stood in the gray winter light and looked at the damaged earth and the old stone walls with their century of paint and the potential of the morning light and the way the space closed around you, with a sense of held breath, of something waiting to be inhabited. I stood there for a long time. Joey stood beside me, not speaking, letting me look. "The soil would need rebuilding from the ground up," I said finally. "It would take at least a season before I could plant anything properly. We'd have to start with foundational work. Composts, amendments, establishing the right structure before anything that grows." "I know," he said. "And the courtyard walls need the paint stripped before we can know what's underneath. That's months of careful work." "I know that too." I looked up at him. He was watching me with that full, open expression, the one he no longer worked to contain. "Yes," I said. He exhaled. Something released in his shoulders, a tension he had been carrying for a month. He reached out and touched my face in the way he did, both hands, deliberate and complete. And the winter light was thin, but warm, and somewhere in the city a church bell rang at a distance. "We'll build it right," he said. "We'll build it slowly," I said. "The right way is always slowly." He kissed my forehead, my temple, the corner of my eye. "I know," he said, against my hair. "I have learned that." Elias arrived on a morning in early spring, when the light was just beginning to change from winter's pale gray into something warmer and more particular. He arrived after a long night and a longer labor and a significant amount of profanity that I will not reproduce here in the interest of the dignity of the record. Joey did not leave the room, not once, not for a moment. He held my hand and he spoke to me in that steady, even voice when I needed steadying, and he said nothing when I did not need words, just remained present and solid and exactly where I needed him to be. When it was over and they placed Elias in my arms, I looked over at Joey and his face was entirely undone, not in a frightening way, in the way of a person who has held themselves together under long discipline and arrived at last at a place where it is safe to let go. His eyes were full and his jaw was working, and he put his hand over mine where I held our son, and he was shaking slightly. I had never loved him more than in that moment. Elias was small. 8 pounds and a half, which is objectively not small but felt like the most concentrated piece of the world I had ever held. He had Joey's coloring, the dark hair and those gray-green eyes that I would know anywhere. He made a specific sound when he was looking at something, a small, interested sound, very focused, like a tiny person who had arrived with opinions and was already forming more. Petra came the second day. She stood at the side of the bed and looked at Elias with an expression that was nothing like triumph or vindication. It was simple, profound relief. The relief of something long waited for, arrived at last. "He looks like his father," she said. "He has his father's eyes," I agreed. She reached out and touched Elias's hand, very gently with one careful finger. Elias wrapped his own finger around it with the automatic grip of the newborn, that small involuntary declaration. Petra Quinn, who I had come to know as a woman who kept her emotions very private, closed her eyes for a moment and breathed. "Elder Quinn would have been so happy," she said quietly. "He waited for this. He was so afraid Joey would run too long." "Tell me about him," I said. "I want to know what kind of man my son is descended from." She sat down. She told me about Elder Quinn for an hour, the builder and the scholar, the quiet man with his boxes of old documents and his absolute unshakable faith in the pattern, the man who had raised a grandson alone after his son's early death and poured into that raising every piece of himself that was good, and who had hoped and feared in equal measure for the right child to stand still long enough to be chosen. Joey came in halfway through her story and stood in the doorway listening. When she was finished, there was a long, good silence. Then Elias made his small, interested sound at the ceiling, and all three of us looked at him, and something in the room that had been held apart for a very long time settled fully, finally, into place. The courtyard garden took 14 months from the day we moved in to the day I considered it genuinely established. Not finished, it will never be finished, that is its nature. But established, rooted, fully itself. The soil rebuilding took the first spring and summer. Joey helped on weekends, learning what I needed him to do without fuss or impatience, following my direction with the focused attention he gave, everything that mattered. We worked side by side in the early mornings while Elias slept, and those mornings became their own kind of ritual. The two of us in the garden while the city was quiet speaking or not speaking, doing the slow good work of making something grow. By the second spring, the foundational plants were fully established, the kind that most people never consciously notice, the ones that do their work in the structure of the soil and the habitat, the ones that make everything else possible. By the second summer, the climbing plants had taken hold on the south-facing wall, and by autumn the first of the trees I had planted as saplings had made enough growth to provide real shade. Joey worked on the building the same way, steadily, without rushing what needed time. He uncovered original stonework under the paint of the courtyard walls, intricate carved detail that had been sleeping under a century of renovation, beautiful and specific, the work of craftsmen who believed what they were building would last. He restored it carefully, each section as a whole project, attending to the integrity of every piece. The building changed with the work, not just aesthetically. The quality of the light inside shifted as he worked, as if the building was remembering how it had been designed to receive the day, as if it was waking up. Elias grew. He was not a quiet child. He was curious and vocal and opinionated and had a habit of picking up small things and studying them with a focused attention that was so precisely like his father's that it made me laugh every time. He was also, from very early, extraordinarily interested in growing things. He would sit in the garden with me for long stretches, not the brief, tolerant presence of a toddler forced into outdoor time, but genuinely engaged, pointing at things and asking what they were, wanting to touch and smell and understand. He was 3 when he asked me, in his direct, particular way, why the plant by the wall was sad. I looked at the plant. It was a young climbing rose I had put in the month before, and it had not taken well, and I had been monitoring it with some concern. I asked him how he knew it was sad. He pointed at it. "It doesn't want to be there," he said. "It wants more room." I moved the rose to a different section of the wall that weekend, a spot with better aspect and less competition from a neighboring shrub. It established within 2 weeks with a vigor that was remarkable. I did not say anything to Joey about this immediately. I held it carefully, the way you hold something that is very fragile or very important, unsure how much to examine it before you have more to go on. 2 weeks later, Elias stood next to Joey in the room he was restoring and pointed at a section of wall that Joey had been puzzling over, uncertain of the structural approach. "That part is weak from inside," Elias said. Joey looked at him. He looked at the wall. He ran a careful hand along the section Elias had indicated and found, beneath the surface, a void that his instruments had not clearly shown, a hollow that explained the instability he had been puzzling over for days. He came to find me immediately. We stood in the kitchen and looked at each other, and there was nothing we needed to say for a while. "He's 3, I said eventually. "He's 3, Joey agreed. "We don't put any of this on him. No, he's a child. We just watch. We just love him. We just love him. We just love him," I agreed. He reached across and took my hand. He held it for a moment in both of his, the way he always had from the beginning. "We did this right," he said. I looked at him, this man who had run for years from the weight of an ancient thing, and had stopped because the love became larger than the fear. This careful, attentive, deeply serious man who had learned to be fully present and was still learning every day with a willingness that moved me every time I saw it. "We did," I told him. "We really did. If I could stand in that bathroom again at 5 in the morning holding that test with 2 lines, knowing what I know now, what would I tell the person looking back at me in the mirror? I would tell him the fear is honest. Don't be ashamed of it. It is the appropriate response to something real and large and consequential arriving in your life without asking permission. You are allowed to be afraid. You are allowed to sit on the edge of the tub for a long time not knowing what to do." I would tell him, call him. Call him the way you did, in the early morning with your voice not entirely steady. The answer will not be what you expect. It will be harder and stranger and more demanding than you expect. It will also be more beautiful. I would tell him the prophecy is not a sentence, neither yours nor his, it is a context, a very old story of which the two of you are the newest chapter, and like all the best stories, it is about choice. It is always about choice. The ancient thing wants your consent and your presence and your full understanding, not your submission. You are not instruments, you are people who are being invited into something larger than yourselves, and there is a profound difference. I would tell him, the man you are about to build a life with is not without fear. He has been afraid for years in ways you will not fully understand until he shows you everything he has been carrying alone. When he shows you, resist the instinct to immediately fix it or to panic. Simply receive it, simply be there for it. That is almost always the thing that matters most. I would tell him, the garden you are going to make is going to be the most beautiful thing you have ever made. Not because it is technically exceptional, though it is, because you will make it in a courtyard of stone in the early mornings beside the person you love, and it will be built on real foundations with patience, with attention to what the soil actually needs rather than what you want to impose on it. It will be a good garden. It will be yours. I would tell him, the child coming is going to look at things with his father's eyes and put his small hands on growing things with your hands. And he is going to have opinions from the moment he arrives, and he is going to be exactly the person he is supposed to be, which is first and foremost a person, and that is more than enough. I would tell him, you are going to fall more deeply in love than you have ever been, not in spite of the difficulty, but through it. The choosing is the love. The staying is the love. Every morning you wake up and decide again, and every morning it is true again, and this is not a diminishment of love, but its actual substance, the daily renewed decision that is so much more than any single dramatic gesture. I would tell him to go wash his face and make tea and call the number with the blue bookmark emoji. I would tell him the rest, the whole extraordinary rest of it is waiting on the other side of that call. That it is worth every single thing it costs. That it is worth more than that. I would tell him, you are about to walk into the oldest story you have ever been part of, and you are going to walk into it with your eyes open, and it is going to change the landscape of your life the way a garden changes the landscape of a building, not by replacing it, not by obscuring it, but by making it finally fully alive. Go. Make the call. Everything you are capable of becoming is waiting for you to begin. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story. And if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.